Good afternoon and welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about brushes, and I'm going to show you a variety of brush materials, brush types, and demonstrate what they can do. I'll talk a little bit about what you can achieve, what brushes you need, and give you some recommendations for what I personally think is the minimum a beginner should really have. I'm not going to focus on any specific brands. I may not really mention what brand some of these brushes are because my focus is on the type of brush and the material rather than the manufacturer. So the first fibre that I'm going to talk about is goat. Goat comes in two colours. This is black and this is white goat. It's a very thirsty fibre. One can use it for washes, one can use it to apply water to the paper. It often comes in these very wide types of brush that are designed for making very large washes or mops. You don't tend to get it in flats and so on. It is incredibly thirsty, and it has a property that it shrinks if you get it too hot. So if you wash it in hot water, what can happen is it will shrink, and then you get a lot of hairs come loose around the ferrule, and that's why a lot of people say they don't like goat brushes, because they shed hair. They shed hair if they're washed in too hot water, so you should always keep them very cool. And my recommendation with any goat brush is that when you get it, you wash it first in baby shampoo or a very, very light, cheap shampoo that doesn't contain silicones and so on. Now, unfortunately, those clear, cheap shampoos have now been marketed as to remove build-up from the hair, and they're very expensive now. But those really cheap, colourless, no dyes, cheap supermarket shampoo is exactly what you need. Just wash these and let them dry. Wash them in cold water, rinse them really well, let them dry, and that will get rid of any loose hairs. It'll get rid of any sizing and help make them really thirsty so that they do their job. So that is goat. That's the first fibre, and obviously it's an animal fibre, which is important to mention as some people have ethical concerns. I'm going to talk next about sable. Sable is the fur of a sort of weaselly thing. It's got a good spring to it, as you can see. There's an element of snap to this brush, and sable is very thirsty too, more thirsty, but it gives you much more control. You can make a nice point with sable that you can't with goat. So sable is what one uses for the brushes for glazes, for applying colour very carefully. Because they're thirsty, if you're not really sure about using them, you can pick up a lot of water and end up diluting your paint so much that one doesn't get quite the effect that one wants. So one has to be quite careful with sable to really practice using it before going wild with it. And there are mimic synthetic sables out there for anyone who doesn't want to support the fur industry. Now, I do eat meat and I try to avoid any animal products that aren't completely necessary, and from my own personal perspective, and it is only a personal perspective, I don't think there's a mimic out there that gives me quite the qualities that I love in sable, so I still use it. I feel bad every time I use it, but the good thing, I guess, is that a watercolour brush that's been looked after could last you a lifetime. I shouldn't need to replace these brushes, so it's not like I'm buying sable every year. They're almost one-offs. They are very expensive. You could be looking at £20 to £30 for a brush this size in normal sable, hundreds of pounds for a much larger round, and you tend to find your rounds, your flats, and certain mops do come in sable. There is kind of a better sable, which is this is kolinsky. A kolinsky is a sort of Russian ferrety, weaselly kind of thing, and it has a much thirstier, finer hair than standard sable. So this fibre is really a high-end sable. It's sometimes just called sable, but it's strictly called kolinsky, or sometimes Russian sable, but you have to be a little bit careful because sometimes they sell it as a synthetic mix, so do be careful that you're buying the pure thing. And this is a one-stroke brush, which you'll see when I move on to brush types later on. Lovely thirsty brush, but again, it has the same property as true sable, that one does have to learn how to use it. Another animal hair is squirrel. This is a black squirrel hairbrush. They're often made in these traditional style with the knots on the wire, and this is plastic, but they used to be goose quill, I believe, there. And the reason they use this is it's a way to pack the hair so tightly that they can cut it into a lovely mop. And these mops can be amongst the best brushes for doing washes, in my view. And again, you can get a mimic squirrel, you can get squirrel synthetic blends. This is the real thing. I'm happy with using it, some people aren't, but again, it's a personal decision. It is not one that I'm going to try and endorse. We do use horsehair sometimes in watercolour. This is a mixture of horsehair and a synthetic fibre. It's usually sold as pony synthetic mix. Big, thirsty brush, again, good for washes. I tend not to use it really with paint. I tend to use these to put water onto the page. Lovely and soft, no real snap to that. They do get a bit raggedy around the edges, but if you wash them really well with shampoo, again, you can bring them back to the point. Some people resize them to get them back to the point themselves. I tend to just wash them in hot water, actually. You can wash pony synthetic in hot, not scalding, but warm, like you would wash your hair in, I guess. Bring it to a point and let it dry, and it will keep its shape again. So they're quite commonly used. If we move over to the synthetic types of brush now, there's all sorts of different synthetic fibres out there that are in common use. The first is a very general purpose synthetic, which is nylon. Now this is a white nylon brush. You can probably hear it has a very good snap, lovely springy fibre. It's a general purpose synthetic. It's green because I used it with phthalo green, and the phthalo pigments do tend to stain white nylon. It's really very general purpose. You could use it with acrylic, you could use it with watercolour. Obviously keep your watercolour brushes separate, don't swap them over, but you could buy two, use one for acrylic, one for watercolour. Now I use this little tiny round for very fine detail because it keeps a lovely point, it's lovely and tight, and because it's got that lovely snap, I can use it with paint straight from the tube if I want a really dark effect. Another synthetic is Taklon, which many of you will have seen before. I'm just going to show one example. There are different colours of Taklon. This is gold Taklon. This is one of my acrylic brushes, actually. It's an acrylic Skyflow brush that I use. And it's a very springy, snappy gold fibre with a slight sheen to it, as you can see there. Not that great for watercolour, I have to say, but for certain effects it can be useful. Never dismiss a fibre, they all have a use for something. Now there are variations on it that are used in watercolour. This is one such synthetic. The reason it looks darker at the tip, and don't confuse this with true dark tip Taklon, is just because of the way it's being cut at the end. These have got a lovely snap to them. They can be great brushes for just getting the paint onto the page at the beginning, but not so much for the detail. Relatively thirsty, but these can be really good if you're not used to sable, for example. Using a synthetic brush can give you more control over the amount of water that you get, so some people like to use them for that reason. There are variations on Taklon. One example is this. This is what's known as dark tip Taklon or dark tip synthetic. They do something to the end. I don't know whether it is shaved down or whether they use heat or radiation to make the end more porous, but it's done so that the end is very porous, and this is what's known as a rigger, and we'll come on to riggers later. They're designed for doing a very neat line, so the end has been made to soak up more paint. There are all sorts of other synthetics. This is a mimic squirrel, which has got the snap of squirrel hair, but it's a dark synthetic. Sometimes they just dye the synthetic so that it looks like the brush that they're kind of intending it to be. Other times they don't. This is another dark tip synthetic there. And then there are the sort of high-end synthetics, if you like. The synthetics that are much more expensive. This is what is known as Dalon, which is Daler and Rowney's synthetic, which is designed to be like sable but better than sable, I suppose. It's got a lovely snap to it. It's a springy, lovely fibre. It's soft, it takes a lot of water, and you can get a lot of control over it. So they're very popular brushes, particularly with people who don't like working with sable or find sable simply too expensive. Another fibre that can be very useful when painting watercolour is another synthetic. This is a CRYLA brush, which is Daler & Rowney's acrylic range, the professional acrylic range. You can see it's made to kind of look like badger bristle, I guess. It's designed to look like fur, even though it's not. I don't know why they bother wasting time and money making it look like fur, because it's going to get covered in paint. But if you see, the snap on that is so strong. It's a really stiff fibre. It can be useful for certain special effects in watercolour to have a brush that hard, but it is not an everyday watercolour brush. I would really not recommend buying CRYLA, which is a hard synthetic fibre brushes for watercolour. It's just not worth it. There are other types of synthetic, just to point them out. This is another Taklon variation, sold by Dalon and Rowney again. And then you start to move over into another type of animal fibre that I haven't mentioned yet, which is hog bristle. This is pig bristle. It comes from different breeds of pig. It's a byproduct of the meat industry. Stiff and snappy, and it has a very unique property that because it has kind of scales and barbs on it, they knit together at the end where they've all been cut. And what that does is that when you push against paint on the page, these are brushes for oil painting. As one does this, they lock together, and it's almost like you're using a rubber pad or something to push the paint along, because oil paints are very hard. These very stiff bristles are not for watercolour, but what they're great for in watercolour painting is blending and scrubbing out errors. So I know many people have a small hog bristle brush and they cut it off very short and they use it as an eraser to basically scrub at paint and remove it from the paper. So that can be done. That is one of many options that one can do. There are other sort of, I suppose, special effect brushes, I guess, that can be used. This is another type of bristle. I think it's a plant fibre bristle rather than a hog bristle. It's a stenciling brush that you may have seen for pushing paint through stencils. Again, can be a useful blender when we're painting in watercolour. And it's not really a brush, but it comes under brushes. This is a sea sponge. There are different sorts of sea sponge. There are different species of sponge that these cellulose skeletons come from, and these can be used for all sorts of effects, for lifting paint, for scrubbing in paint, for applying paint to make backgrounds. They're very useful really actually with acrylic, but they can be used a lot in watercolour, so don't forget that it's important to have those. They can be really very, very useful. And there are also foams as well, and these are what we sort of call craft brushes. It's a foam pad on a stick. We use these in decoupage for applying Mod Podge to things. But where these can be useful in watercolour is if one wanted to apply a granulation medium over a whole sheet of paper before one started, or wanted to apply gum arabic or something like that. These could be useful. So they may be something worth having one of, but again, you don't need them unless you want to do certain special effects. So don't go too crazy and start buying things that one simply doesn't need. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about different brush types, shapes, morphologies and so on. And in doing so I'm going to introduce some fibres that I haven't already talked about, because they're not brushes that I tend to use for many things. So I wouldn't have a sort of a range of brushes made of these fibres necessarily. So the first brush I'm going to talk about is not the sort of standard rounds and flats. I'm going to start with the more unusual ones. Two different brushes here, very different, but they have something in common. This is a dagger, and this is a sword. And now a dagger is sometimes sold as a sword. It is most certainly not a sword, it's much shorter. Sometimes they have a slight, like they almost have a hook at one end like that, sometimes when you buy them. This one doesn't. I love this brush for painting watercolour actually, even though it's an acrylic brush. It's from the System 3 range from Dalon and Rowney, which is their one down from professional, so it's kind of high-end amateur acrylic brush. I love this. It's great for painting grass and things like that. Now the purpose of daggers and swords is as liners. Now what liners are for is drawing lovely thin straight lines from the sign writing days. You can also get a brush that's just called a liner, which is like this but cut off here, so it's got a lovely flat end, and again these draw lovely thin lines. What one can do with them when they're loaded with paint is draw lovely sweeping strokes and paint blades of grass. And what I will do is at the end of this video I will show you some of these brushes in action. Now the fibre this one's made out of looks like blonde hair, but it's not. It's a fibre called prolene, which you will have heard on medical programs where they ask for a 5-0-prolene, for stitching, suturing human flesh. And that's what this is. This is prolene, which is the surgical stitch material, but it can be used in brushes, and they're manufactured by a company called ProArt, and the swords are their 9A range. There's the details there. They're based in the United Kingdom, and I have to say I haven't been disappointed with anything I have brought from them. As well as being very good brushes, they are actually really just very beautiful. They're just really nicely made, nicely varnished. There's some adhesive still there from the price tag. Nicely varnished, really beautiful brush. It's weighted really well, and they draw beautiful lines. And I will intercut this with some of my work that I've done using these brushes. So don't dismiss prolene. It might be something you want to try. It's very soft, but it has a decent bit of snap to it. And one of the many uses of these brushes is that because they're very springy, you don't have to use them for drawing nice neat lines. You can use them to apply things in a much more random manner because their springiness enables them to do it. So that's almost like a hack to me. It's almost like we're not using it for its intended purpose. So the sword and the dagger are great for both straight lines and for that sort of scrubby detail that we sometimes want. Large brushes are quite important, and I have a whole range of these big flat brushes, sometimes called Skyflow, sometimes just called flats. These are made of goat. There are Hake brushes, which are the Japanese with the long handle, that are kind of similar in style. They're a bit shorter hair than this usually. They're also made of goat. The purpose of these kinds of brushes in modern watercolour really is to apply large amounts of water quickly to the paper, or large amounts of paint to the paper. Now, what I often use them for is after I've just done a wash. Let's imagine I've done a sky, so I might have done some ultramarine, I might have done some alizarin crimson and then some yellow down here to do a sort of sunset. I might get one of these and soften and blend as the paint is nearly dry. Just go over and soften the lines and make it just a little bit more misty, and it gives the look as though you're on a misty morning or a misty evening, especially over the sea where you get that very, very almost hazy air that isn't quite a true mist. Mops are a similar brush. Another black goat mop, which I've already showed to you. Great for getting lots of water onto the page very quickly. Can be useful if you've just got one of these in a jar of clean water and you just use it to apply water to areas of the page as you go. They don't have much other use, but I do like them for just being able to get the paper really wet really quickly. Be warned, these carry a hell of a lot of water, so they can make your paper too wet till you know how to control them properly. Similar to those in shape, I suppose, in some ways, are the oval washes. This is an oval wash. You can see it's basically, it would be a sort of flat wash, but this is puffed out really, and this is a goat hair oval wash. They're not always made of goat. They do come in a variety of other materials. Let's grab one here. This is a pony synthetic oval wash, much smaller, not quite so puffy, and these are good because you've got that oval edge and you can get quite into corners with them and do little detail, and I think they're a really useful brush to have because they're almost a hybrid of a round and a flat. There is a similar brush, and I don't have one quite to hand, called a filbert or a cat's tongue, which is very similar but cut to slightly more of a point, and they are absolutely one of the most useful brushes, which is why all of mine are actually being washed at the moment, and I don't have any of them to hand in my brush jar. The standard flat, which they're very similar to, this is a synthetic flat, 1/2 inch. Very useful brush, really good for wet on dry actually, because these can push paint around really well on dry paper. I find those a really invaluable brush, and there are variations on the theme of the flat. One of them is the one stroke, which is another sign writing brush really, rather than a painting brush, which is like this. They have this much flatter end. This is a Kolinsky brush from Winsor & Newton, and these are designed to do lettering in one stroke, or to do one stroke of the lettering, I believe is the origin of the name. We have the standard round brush, which comes in all sorts of variations. This is a pointed round brush. There are the more round brushes. They are almost the bread and butter brush of watercolour painting. You will do most of your painting with a round brush. This is just the standard synthetic. I've also got the higher end Dalon synthetic. You can see they've all got different textures. There is really no answer to which fibre should I be using. Some people prefer synthetic for ethical reasons. Some people prefer synthetic because of the way it interacts with the paint and the water. Some people prefer sable, some people prefer kolinsky, some prefer squirrel. I personally think it's down to you. You decide what works for you, and you get that through experimentation and play, which is why one should always, if you're with a friend who has more brushes than you, ask if you can have a little play with their brushes and decide what you like. This is a different type of mop, the sort of traditional squirrel quill mop. These are one of my favourite brushes when you're doing very wet work, because it holds a lot of paint or a lot of water, and you can keep control because it has a pointed tip. So you can follow a line very easily, and you can do lots of clever reflections with them. The fan blender is a fairly standard brush in watercolour. This is a dark tip synthetic for watercolour. You could use a hog bristle one, or you may want a hog bristle one as well, because you can use those for much more scrubby work when you may want to lift paint. These have all sorts of uses. You can use them just as a way to blend, or even apply paint with them. I've seen people do that just to get a very gentle flow of paint. You can push them together, you can bunch them up, you can scrub with them. I like them for doing reflections in water because you can sort of move down the page and do these gentle reflections where you've just got little ripples in the water. Or you can use them when one's doing a waterfall or similar, because when they're wet with paint, these bristles do sort of bunch up a little bit, and you'll just get a few threads touching the page as you move down, so they can be quite nice too. There's bigger flats, pony synthetic flats. These are good for just applying water, but when you need the control of a flat to follow a line rather than a small a sable or a better quality, I suppose, brush. And then there are things like this little tiny round. You also get similar brushes that are cut even shorter, which are known as spotters, which are indeed for doing little spots, little dots of highlighting on eyes. And then brushes like these, which are called riggers, or sometimes mast liners, because they are used for drawing the lines on masts. There's a dark tip synthetic and a kolinsky here, and you can see they don't look like they're capable of drawing a line because they're pretty splayed when they're dry, but once they're wetted, like so, that will follow a beautiful, neat line. I'm not going to do it on the paper because I want to use the paper for something in a moment. But you can follow a beautiful, neat line, and in a later video, and I'll be doing at some point, I will show you how to follow that line and keep it so neat and tidy as one works. The other kind of brush, if you like, is the colour shaper, which is a silicone wedge. They come in all sorts of different sorts. I picked this one up for about £5. It's by Royal Sovereign, and it's got on one end of it a nylon brush. I was really surprised. I was expecting to be a really crap nylon brush. It's actually surprisingly good. I really enjoyed painting with it because it had really good control. And I would say size-wise that is probably a 7 or 8 round, roughly. And then this little wedgy tool on the end, the colour shaper, it's really useful because you can do things like lifting paint with it by scrubbing. But where it's really good is if you use masking fluid, use this to apply it, because you get lovely control, you can do lovely straight lines, almost knife edge precision, and it doesn't get damaged by the masking fluid. So it's a really useful tool to use for all sorts of different activities. So that's a little lowdown of some of the types of brush that we have. What I'm now going to do is show some examples of what lines or patterns they produce, and I'll just talk through those in just a moment. Okay, I've now painted out using some of the brushes to show you what effects we can get, and I just wanted to show you first of all over here what I've done is taken a large round in different fibres, and I've painted either Winsor Red or Bismuth yellow just so that you can see the differences and just to show you what you actually get. So first of all, let's have a look at this pony synthetic mix. It's very pale, That's the first thing we notice. And what I did is I just painted 3 stripes from the top, didn't re-wet or add more paint at all. You can see it fades away very strongly there. The reason it's so pale is because the brush holds so much water that it will dilute the paint unless you mix up a very, very thick wash of the paint in a palette, dry the brush after dampening it and suck up the paint. Then you can get a really intense wash. But this is what commonly happens when people who are quite new to watercolour use a very thirsty brush for the first time. You get that kind of problem. Now, owing to the size of these brushes, it's actually pretty hard to do that without wasting a lot of paint. So these can be just useful when you want to get that kind of faded, washed out look, especially in a background or a wash, or just to apply water. But I don't use them for paint very often myself. A synthetic round gives you a reasonable line. I know the bismuth yellow is kind of hard to see compared to the red, but it gave reasonable coverage, but it's not a very thirsty brush. The Dalon, which is intended to be kind of better than sable, is pretty good in its initial pass, but those 2 lines on the outside, I did the middle one first, are very bitty. It lost its water by that point, so it doesn't actually hold an awful lot of water, but it does hold a lot of paint on the tip and it doesn't dilute it out. The squirrel, pretty good, holds a lot of water and a lot of paint together at that point, and I really like that fibre. Sable, again, great coverage, takes on a lot of paint, doesn't dilute it out, and the Kolinsky, very similar too. So that's why I really prefer those fibres to these ones, in short. I then did some effects. What I did here was I painted 2 thin lines of Quinacridone Magenta, and then filled in the gap between them evenly using a synthetic flat, just so that there was a stripe. And you can just about see there how I did it. At the bottom, what I did is I just went back and forth over it with a dry fan blender, just to show how you can fade out something and soften things using a fan blender really effectively. I then picked up Winsor Red on the fan blender and did this kind of effect, which is a really easy way to show reflection. That's something many people like to do with them. Just ignore this little bit of yellow here. That was just me cleaning off a brush without really thinking about it. Down here, I just scrubbed the fan blender around after doing that, just to show that as it drops its colour, you can get some quite interesting effects. I then did vertical with the fan blender here, which is a common way to make grass or scrub, particularly on a snowy background, because it almost looks like it's coming through the white of the paper. Not much paint on the brush at that point, which is why it's very faint. And then finally, these 2 grassy effects at the top. The red on the left here, which is Winsor Red, on that synthetic dagger that I showed you earlier, and it gives a lovely wide blade of grass effect, but you can't go thin, it only does the wide effect. Over here, where you've got different widths, different faintnesses, right from this almost hair width here to these quite thick stripes here and these ones in between, these were all done with that prolene sword, just by rotating it slightly to give you different effects. They are different. The dagger versus the sword don't give the same effect, but I think the prolene as a fibre gives wonderfully interesting effects, and it sharpens to such a tight point that one can get these very, 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 very fine lines, which you can't get with the synthetic because you can't get it to come to such a tight point. So there was just some examples for you of different brushes, different fibres, what they can and can't do. Really just a basic introduction to brushes. Now, what do I think a beginner needs? I get asked this a lot. I would say that the beginner needs a Skyflow or a wide flat simply to get water on the paper quickly. You probably need a couple of rounds, and I would say to get something about 20, 12, 8, 6, maybe a 1 or a 2. And really, you need to start with the big brushes and work your way to small ones during each painting. You probably need a couple of flats at most. It's best to just have a couple of small flats. You don't need large ones really. You probably want to have a fan blender, and you might want a special effect brush like a sword or a dagger. And there are all sorts of other special effect brushes out there, like doe's foot brushes. That's really it. And I do think, just as a beginner should always paint with a minimal palette, I think it's also valuable for a beginner to learn to paint with just a few brushes, to learn what they can do and learn to make the most of their brushes before they splash out and buy dozens and dozens of brushes. Now, I'm sitting here and I've probably got about 20 brushes in my watercolour pot, and I've probably got about double that in my acrylic pot. The reason being that I ruin acrylic brushes, so I buy them when they're cheap in the sale in January, and I ruin them. I'm not very good at maintaining them. And I have 2 or 3 oil brushes because I don't really paint oil, and when I do, I tend to paint with a palette knife. So in very much the Leonard Afremov style, I don't really use brushes. So that's all I have. But watercolour, I have a lot of brushes. The primary reason is I buy them when they're cheap. I don't pay full price for brushes. If they're in the sale, I will buy them whether I need them or not quite often, and I'll just keep them in the packaging until the time comes that maybe I do need them. I don't tend to buy duplicates, so I don't have, like with my acrylics, I have 3 or 4 of the same brush. 3 or 4 long-handled filberts in the same size. I don't do that with watercolour. I'll just have a small number of brushes, and if I need them, I take them out of the packaging and use them. If I don't need them, I might give them to a friend or sell them on eBay, because I bought them cheap and can sell them for a higher price. But most of the time I just buy what I need. Like the latest brush I bought was the Prolene sword. This is my most recent addition to my collection, and this was about £6, and that is actually probably as much as I would pay for a brush that I'm not going to use a lot. An effects brush like this is not going to be an everyday brush, whereas I bought a set of 4 Kolinsky brushes. That's these ones from Winsor & Newton. They've got beautiful ergonomic handles there. I bought a set of 4 of these, which was a 1-stroke and a rigger, and I think it's a 4-round and a 0-round or a 1-round, something like that. And that set should have been about £50, and I got them for £12.99 in a sale. I bought them because I would much rather use Kolinsky than anything else, so as soon as I bought them, that meant that my synthetic equivalents in the same size or whatever no longer really get used. It is useful sometimes to have multiple brushes in the same size, depending on what you're painting, as sometimes it's just convenient to, rather than having to keep washing the brushes out, to just have one for each of the 3 paints on your palette or whatever you're doing. But in all honesty, it's better to have fewer brushes and learn how to use them than have loads of brushes that you just never use. So don't kind of be fooled into thinking because everyone on YouTube's got dozens of brushes that you need dozens of brushes. You really, really don't. A lot of us have a lot of brushes because we get them free for review, or some of us teach and have them for that reason. Other of us buy them because we want to try them out so that we can tell you all about them, so that you know what they can and can't do. Many of us simply like trying out different effects. Now, a lot of people might never ever want to paint a meadow of grass, so they will never own a sword. I bought a sword just because I wanted to paint that effect specifically. I tried painting it with other brushes to see if I could get away with it, and I couldn't, and I bought it, and I loved the effect that it gave. That was after I tried it, actually, this effect with the dagger first, and I wasn't quite happy. I moved to a sword, loved it, might not use the dagger much anymore, and I think every couple of years you should have a review of your brushes, and anything you're really not using, either force yourself to use it, maybe using my 3-jar inspiration method that's on my blog, where you could basically force yourself to use a specific brush to paint a painting of a specific subject every day, to stretch yourself and make yourself use things a little bit more. It's a really good way to stretch your imagination and make sure you use up your supplies, actually. Or you could ditch them or give them to a friend. There is no point keeping items you don't use, and I think that is a really, really key thing for people who do any kind of arts and crafts. Don't keep supplies you're not using. And I'm as guilty of that as anybody else. I hope this video has been helpful. Give me a thumbs up or add some comments. Tell me what things you'd like to know about. If you'd like to know more about any of these brushes, or there are other types you'd like to know about, pop a comment and I will see what I can do. Thank you all very much. Good evening. Right, yeah, I just wanted to show an example here of a painting I did. This is Meadow series painting of mine. It's called Meadow 1. It's some grass, blades of grass in a meadow, and it uses a very minimal palette of cad red. I think I used transparent yellow, permanent sap green, French ultramarine, and cobalt blue. But this was done using the sword and the dagger. I just wanted to show what one can achieve using them, and that they were the only 2 brushes I used to do the whole thing. Just wanted to share that example with everyone. Bye bye.